My dad, Jim, died of Alzheimer's disease in 2016. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's back in 2008. By the time Jim's Alzheimer's was detected, he was already in middle stage. For an overview of the stages of Alzheimer's, I invite you to check out other of my YouTube content. Additionally, for more information, you can visit my website, alzheimersproof.com. Eventually, though, my dad was correctly diagnosed on the basis of a cognitive examination. Basically questions that sort of probe to see what his mental abilities are. But there are several kinds of tests available, each purporting to be able to detect Alzheimer's in one way or other. Let me give a quick rundown. Let me give the usual disclaimer. I am not a doctor. I cannot diagnose conditions. The information that I'm about to share is just episodes from my experience and research that I've conducted. And I should also give a caveat. None of the tests is definitive, except for one. In general, though, the tests are going to divide into two categories. One category is going to be those that evaluate a person's abilities or skills. And a second category is going to be that's going to evaluate a person's anatomy or physiology. It's actually going to look at the physical structures of the body. Let's go first. On the one hand, you have tests that are going to evaluate a person's abilities or skills. Sometimes these are going to be physical abilities. So for example, there's a test that is based on the ability to balance on one leg. The idea is that a person who is able to balance on one leg beyond 5 seconds has got normal cognitive ability. And if you're unable to balance for more than 5 seconds, then there may be some abnormality. Now here's an example of how the tests are not definitive. There are any number of conditions that might affect a person's balance. Alzheimer's is just one of those. A second example has received quite a lot of press in the last couple of years. That is what they call the peanut butter smell test. The idea of this test is somewhat interesting. You take a container of peanut butter and a ruler, and the ruler is placed from the person's nose down to the peanut butter container. And the idea, as strange as it sounds, is to move the peanut butter up the ruler until the subject can actually register he or she smells the peanut butter. The idea is that a person who's got cognitive impairment, like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, is going to be unable to smell the peanut butter until it's very close to the nose. Now, it is an intriguing test, and it's certainly one that's very easy to duplicate in a home environment. However, there are some cautionary notes. For one thing, from published accounts of the test, it's not entirely clear how the results are to be interpreted. So for instance, if you have a 12-inch ruler, is a person at risk of Alzheimer's disease if they're 5 inches or less, or it's not clear what the numbers are. And in fact, it probably depends on a person's baseline, what they were able to smell before their cognitive impairment. So once again, it's an interesting idea, but it's certainly not a conclusive test. But again, the basic notion of this test is the idea that a person with some sort of cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's is also going to experience perceptual changes, and that's kind of what this test is trading on. The test also has a reliance on self-reporting. Self-reporting is the idea that you have to depend on the subject to give a response before you're able to interpret the data. And in the case of a cognitive impairment, a self-report may be unreliable. Another set of evaluations would be those that focus on cognitive capabilities rather than physical capabilities. With the peanut butter test, we're dealing with a person's sense of smell. With the balance test, we were dealing with a person's ability to balance themselves. With a cognitive test, we're dealing with things like how do we process information, reasoning, memory, and the like of that. So one such variation, there are a number of variations. One is called the MiniMental state examination. And there are many variations of this, but on that test, basically the person would be asked a series of questions. Questions might be, how many months are there in a year? What is the current date? Who's the president? The person would also be given a list of words, maybe 5 words, 3 words, 10 words, to memorize, and then the person would be asked if they recall the list at various points in the test. Typically, between the giving of the list of words and each time they're asked for it, there are intermediate tasks. Some of the tasks might be to draw the hands of a clock face and put the numbers around the clock in order. These intermediate tasks are designed to sort of tax the person's memory. If they can remember the list after the intermediate tasks, then they probably have no cognitive impairment. On the other hand, there are tests that actually examine a person's anatomy or physiology. One example of this that's somewhat interesting is a kind of an eye test where the person's macula, the thickness of the macula, is actually measured. Now, the macula is a part of the retina, and of course the retina is that part of the eye onto which the visual image is projected through the lens of the eye. It turns out that the thickness of the macula has a correspondence to certain cognitive impairments. The thinner the macula, the more likely a person is to be cognitive impaired. This is the thinking. There's also research underway for the development of a blood test, and the blood test would be designed to detect various biomarkers that are indicative of Alzheimer's disease. Another example would be a lumbar puncture or so-called spinal tap. This test would be designed to get at the cerebrospinal fluid and in that way sort of detect some of the proteins that are characteristic of the Alzheimer's plaques and tangles that form in the brain. However, the most widespread physical tests have got to be, number one, the genetic test. The genetic test is designed to detect the presence of various genes that are supposed to be indicative of a potential or predisposition to Alzheimer's. One of these is the so-called APOE gene. And the idea is that if you have this gene, then you're predisposed genetically to having dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The second most commonly used test is going to be that which is called positron emission tomography. It's called a PET scan, and this is a scan of the brain that's able to detect areas in tissue that are not as healthy as they should be. Maybe they lack oxygen or blood flow or something. So if the PET scan reveals degenerated portions of the brain, it's an indication that the person has Alzheimer's disease. So interestingly, with the physical tests, we have those like the blood test and the genetic test that might actually hold promise for detecting Alzheimer's well before it even starts. And then you have other tests like the PET scan or the spinal tap, which are able to detect Alzheimer's once it sort of gets going. But the final test is the one that is the most definitive. But unfortunately, it's also the one that's the least useful for people while they're alive, and that's because it's an autopsy. So of course, an autopsy is performed on a dead body, and the idea of the autopsy is to medically determine the cause of death. So in an autopsy, the doctor performing the autopsy is able to actually look at the brain tissue directly and confirm the presence of the sort of protein plaques and tangles that are characteristic of the disease. That's the one test that is the most definitive, but again, it's not going to be useful for diagnostic purposes while a person is alive. I hope that something that I said was of use to you. I hope that you got something out of the presentation today. You can feel free to check back to this channel for additional content as it becomes available. I hope that something that I said was of use to you, and I appreciate you tuning in today. For more information, you feel free to see other videos that I've done or check out the articles that I have on my website, alzheimersproof.com. Thank you for watching.